Dimensions of the soul. Devotional literature addresses this inward domain in an eminently practical way, attempting to shape the soul according to the revealed models. There is, of course, no contradiction between thinking of God as transcendent and perceiving Him as immanent, any more than there is a contradiction between perceiving Him as merciful and as wrathful. God reveals Himself under a variety of guises, and these in turn demand different rational perceptions and psychological responses. One cannot think in exactly the same terms about the glorified Al-Subba, who transcends everything that man can conceive, and the near Al-Qarib, who is closer than the jugular vein. Nor can one feel the same toward the gentle, the kind, and the compassionate as one feels toward the vengeful and the severe in punishment. Once codified and institutionalized, the human responses to God's self-revelations in the Quran came to emphasize certain divine attributes rather than others. One response was called "jurisprudence", another "kalam", another "Sufism", and so on. All of these points of view coexist in the great representatives of Islam, just as they coexist in the Quran and in the soul of the Prophet. But in the early period, it is difficult to disentangle the different strands, since the institutional forms which highlight them have not yet come into existence. However, it is easy to see that certain manifestations of early Islam tend in one direction or another. The particular characteristic of the devotional literature such as the Sahifa is to emphasize the personal quality of God's relationship with His servants and His all-pervading love. The predominance of mercy. Some modern-day Muslims and many Western scholars have looked at the Quran wearing the eyeglasses of the jurists and theologians. As a result, they see a God who is a just and stern commander, concerned only with beating His servants into shape so that they will follow His law. They tend to ignore the fact that practically every chapter of the Quran begins with the words, "In the name of God, the All-Merciful, the All-Compassionate," and that the Quran mentions God's names of mercy, compassion, kindness, generosity, forgiveness, and love about 10 times as often as it mentions His names of wrath and severity. The overwhelming Quranic picture is that of a God deeply concerned with the well-being of His creatures and ready to forgive almost anything, if only they will repent and acknowledge His sovereignty. Faced with the reality of both mercy and wrath, the worshipper seeks out the one and does everything he can to avoid the other. This is a constant theme in the devotional literature in general and the Sahifa in particular. The Prophet set the pattern in his well-known supplication. "I seek refuge in thy good pleasure from thy displeasure and in thy pardon from thy punishment. I seek refuge in thee from thee." God is both He who becomes pleased and He who becomes displeased, He who pardons and He who punishes. Hence the worshipper prays to God for protection against God Himself, since there is no other significant threat. Moreover, the servant can be confident that God's mercy will in fact overcome His wrath, since God is essentially merciful and only accidentally wrathful. The Quran tells us in 2 verses that God's mercy embraces all things 7. 156:47, but it never suggests that His wrath is so universal. According to a famous hadith Qudsi, God says, "My mercy precedes my wrath," or "has precedence over my wrath," or "predominates over my wrath." God appears to His creatures as harsh and domineering only in certain circumstances and for specific purposes which themselves are defined by mercy. The Prophet expressed this point with his remark, "Hellfire is a whip with which God drives His servants to paradise." God's mercy is so overwhelmingly real that He will certainly overlook the sins of those who open themselves up to it. Padwick refers to the "mosaic" quality of Muslim supplications. She writes, "While the prayers of some of the great saints show a spiritual individuality, the great mass of these devotions is built up of well-tried small items arranged in ever-new patterns, traditional prayers of the Prophet, Quran verses, blessings of the Prophet, forgiveness seekings, cries of praise, all unknown and authorized forms." The Sahifa is strongly marked by the individuality of the Imam, while also displaying this mosaic quality. But this quality itself reflects the Quran, which is a mosaic of God's names and activities, stories of the prophets, legal injunctions, and promises and warnings about the last day. It was said above that one of the purposes of supplication is to shape the imagination of the worshipper in accordance with Islamic norms. A well-known hadith tells us that Muslims can know the character khuluq of the Prophet through studying the Quran. By following the Prophet's sunnah, the worshipper absorbs the Quran on all levels of his being, and in turn he is absorbed by the Quran, the divine word, and the divine model of his own soul. If some early authorities referred to the Sahifa as the sister of the Quran, part of the reason for this may lie in the fact that its mosaic quality expresses a variety of spiritual attitudes that reflect accurately the Quranic and prophetic model for human perfection. Every element in the Sahifa's mosaic corresponds to elements of the Quranic text and the Prophet's soul. The connection between the spiritual attitudes expressed in the Sahifa and the Quranic statements about God and his relationship to his servants can most clearly be perceived in the Imam's constant recourse to God's names and his always appropriate expression of the corresponding human attitude. On the one hand, the Imam places great emphasis upon his own inadequacy and sinfulness, acknowledging that he deserves nothing but God's wrath. On the other, he repeatedly takes refuge in God's mercy and in God's own Quranic statements concerning the primacy of forgiveness, asking God to do with him as is worthy of such a merciful being, not as he himself deserves. Act toward me with the forgiveness and mercy of which thou art worthy. Act not toward me with the chastisement and vengeance of which I am worthy. 73.3. In short, through the mosaic of the supplication, the worshipper moves from viewpoint to viewpoint in keeping with the different relationships which exist between himself and God as described in the Quran. Man's point of view changes because each of the divine names points to a different face of God turned toward him. Yet all are faces of God, and there is no God but God, so the apparent multiplicity of names and faces dissolves into the divine unity. Human inadequacy and sin are real enough on their own level, and the Sahifa among others shows a remarkable awareness of the depth of human imperfection. But the great spiritual authorities of Islam hold that in responding to human weakness, God's overwhelming mercy takes charge and the divine wrath pales by comparison. The more that human beings admit to their own inadequacy, the more they call down upon themselves God's pity and commiseration. Supplication and pleading are the natural human response to the Shahada, the fact that man is nothing compared to God, and that God, who is fundamentally mercy, is the only true reality. Supplication responds to God's command. Despair not of God's mercy. Surely God forgives all sins. 39:53. A hadith is related concerning Imam Zayn al-Abidin which is worth recounting because it is so completely in character with the Sahifa's emphasis upon God's mercy and forgiveness. One day he was told that Hassan al-Basri d. 110,728, the famous ascetic, had said, "It is not strange if a person perishes as he perishes. It is only strange that a person is saved as he is saved." The Imam replied, "But I say that it is not strange if a person is saved as he is saved. It is only strange that a person perishes as he perishes, given the scope of God's mercy." The supplicant who responds to the God of the Quran never forgets the wrath of God, but he remains confident that God's essential nature will show itself, in spite of his own weaknesses. Padwick was so struck with the devaluation of human sins that seems to result from this attitude that she displays a rare instance of Christian bias, objecting that it leads to a certain moral shallowness in some forgiveness-seeking prayers and is unable to attribute any moral cost to God's forgiveness, alluding herein in the rest of the passage to the Christian doctrine of atonement. Among three examples of moral shallowness, she cites the following lines from Imam Zayn al-Abidin, found in al-Sahifat al-Khamisa. "My God, my sins do not harm thee and thy pardon does not impoverish thee. Then forgive me what does not harm thee and give me what thou wilt not miss." In order to understand the attitude expressed here, one needs to put it into its larger context. The specific attitude expressed by the Imam corresponds precisely to the reality of God's infinite mercy and forgiveness as revealed in various Quranic verses. Many passages from the Sahifa present the same point of view. Moreover, when the Imam says, "Thou art the generous Lord for whom the forgiveness of great sins is nothing great," 31.10, or pardoning great sin is nothing great for thee, overlooking.